Hi everyone, this is Counseling 3010 Writing Tips for Thesis Statement. A majority of the information you're getting here is hyperlinked to this place where I got most of that information. All right, so let's start by defining the thesis statement. So what is a thesis statement? Every paper you write should have a main point, a main idea, or central message. The arguments you make in your paper should reflect this main idea. The sentence that captures your position on this main idea is what we call a thesis statement. So basically what it is, when you watch a movie, what's the point of that movie? When you read a book, what is the point of the book, right? So, and each book and each movie will be different. So your paper should have its unique thesis statement to describe it so that if someone wants to, let's say, read it, and they want to know, what is the main point when they're skimming through the beginning part, they should kind of understand. How long does it need to be? A thesis statement focuses your ideas in one or two sentences. It should present the topic of your paper and also a comment about your position in relation to that topic. Your thesis statement should tell your reader what the paper is about and also help guide your writing and keep your argument focused. So the first statement might be about the topic, and then the second statement or the second part of it might be how this paper is going to be unique by the evidence or the ideas that you are going to introduce. And we will explore this a little bit more as we go along through this lecture, and we'll talk about different examples as well, so you can kind of understand what's going on. Okay, so now we're going to have questions to ask when formulating your thesis. Basically what that means is, what are some questions that are common when someone is writing their thesis statement? Okay, so where is your thesis statement? You should provide a thesis early in your essay, in the introduction or in the longer essays in the second paragraph, in order to establish your position and give your reader a sense of direction. And that's very true, right? So when you start reading a paper, you kind of want to know what the point of it at the beginning, like, at least what the ideas are, because like you don't want someone to read through halfway through, let's say a 10-page paper, and then they're like, what is this paper about? What am I reading about? I don't even understand what the point of it is yet, or is there a point? So definitely you want to introduce it at the beginning so that people know and they're going to go, okay, well, this is about this, and now I'm going to start reading and I'm like, oh, okay, I get that. That makes sense or whatever. All right, now let's talk about some tips. In order to write a successful thesis statement, avoid burying a great thesis statement in the middle of a paragraph or late in the paper. So we want to be able to, at the beginning of your paper, again, like the previous slide said, read it immediately and go, okay, well, this one is about whales, or this one is about people with disabilities. You want to be able to know that immediately. Be as clear and as specific as possible. Avoid vague words. Vague basically means unclear, okay? We don't really understand what the purpose of this is. This is because the way that you're answering it. It's like when someone goes, hey, how are you doing? And they're like, and you're like, what was that? That's being vague. They could have said good or bad or whatever it is, but instead they're like, and so that's considered vague. And when you write, we don't want you to write vague because that means that other people have to read your vague words. Indicate the point of your paper, but avoid sentence structures like, the point of my paper is. Okay, so that is a very high school, junior high school, elementary school style. So those are for people who are under 18, who are still learning how to read and write. So you never ever in a college paper go, the purpose of my paper is, or the point of my paper is, or I'm going to write a paper about this in your paper, because we already know this is a paper, right? You're in college, you're writing papers. We understand that this is a paper. You don't have to point it out like that, So you want to start right into the topic of whatever it is that you're writing about and then move on. Never ever put in the essay that I am writing about right now is about, because we already know it's an essay. Is your thesis statement specific? Your thesis statement should be as clear and specific as possible. Normally, you will continue to refine your thesis as you revise your arguments, so your thesis will evolve and gain definition as you obtain a better sense of where your argument is taking you. So when I meet with you to talk about your paper, I just want to know kind of where you are and what kind of research you have done. And you can tell me the ideas or the themes that you have picked up from your research, right? And then from there, we will kind of understand where you're going. When I read your paper or not your paper, but like when we meet and we talk about your ideas, I kind of want to know where you're going so that maybe we can refine it to make it so that it is more specific, okay? If you write a paper about how smoking is bad for you, I'm going to go, duh, because we all know smoking is bad for you, right? It's like saying when you drink alcohol, you're going to get drunk. You know, like, why would I read a paper about that? We all know those things, right? But when we talk about, let's say, a specific thing about smoking or drinking, then the paper might be a little bit more unique, okay? Here are some tips. Are there two large statements connected loosely by a coordinating conjunction? That would be and, but, or, for, nor, so, yet. So those are considered coordinating conjunctions. Would a subordinating conjunction help? Through, although, because, since, to signal a relationship between the two sentences. Or do the two statements imply a fuzzy, unfocused thesis? If so, settle on one single focus and then proceed with further development. So again, you can use these words to add to make, let's say, your statements a little bit more interesting for your paper, but it's not necessary, right? But these are keywords that you would use so that we can see a contrast or a relationship between the two statements that you are making. Is your thesis statement too general? Too general basically means, is it just nothing that interesting? Is it just too regular, right? Your thesis should be limited to what can be accomplished in a specified number of pages. Shape your topic so that you can get straight to the meat of it. Being specific in your paper will be much more successful than writing about general things that you do not say much. Don't settle for 3 pages of just skimming the surface. So here's something that you need to know as a student. Teachers can tell when you are just making up words to fill up a page, right? And this is why sometimes teachers don't like it when students ask the students ask the teacher, how many pages does it have to be? There might be a general, like kind of like 6 to 10 pages or whatever, and that's because we, as a teacher, want to see what you can put in when it comes to looking for information for your paper. So we don't want you to just, fill up 3 pages of nonsense writing, right? Just to fill up those 10-page requirements, okay? But typically, a good research paper in undergraduate is about 10 pages long. Okay, but you want to actually fill it up with meaningful content, which is why we ask you to look for a certain amount of research or a lot of research, because that will allow you to fill it in so that it's all meaningful information and content. All right, the opposite of a focused, narrow, crisp thesis is a broad, sprawling, superficial thesis. Okay, so let's define some of these words just so you know what it means, okay? The opposite of focused, right? Focus is clear, right? Or narrow. Narrow is very specific. Crisp is like, right to the point. Is broad. Broad means like wide range, right? Sprawling. Sprawling is kind of like the desert. The desert just goes on and on and on, right? Or superficial. Superficial basically means just skin deep. It doesn't have a lot of meaning, Superficial means light. It doesn't really have any meat to the content. So compare this original thesis, which is too general, with 3 possible revisions, which are more focused, each presenting a different approach to the same topic. All right, so the original thesis that a student wrote here is, there are serious objections to today's horror movies. Okay, so that's a pretty general statement, right? Is that some people don't like horror movies. Yeah, well, What about it? You didn't tell me anything that interesting. We kind of know that, right? Horror movies can be not cool, but that's it. What does that mean? So now let's go to the next page and then read some more specific, more focused, narrow, crisp thesis statements, okay, that offer a perspective, a point of view from that writer. Okay, so here they are. Because modern cinematic techniques have allowed filmmakers to get more graphic, horror flicks have desensitized young American viewers to violence. Okay, let's read it again. Because modern cinematic techniques have allowed filmmakers to get more graphic, horror flicks have desensitized young American viewers to violence. So what this is saying now for the person who wrote this is because the special effects are so real now in horror movies that people don't get grossed out when there's actual, let's say, blood and pain. That's what it's saying. And they're like, okay, that makes sense. It's about the special effects being so good because of the computers, right? So that is a pretty good, intro to the topic that you would read, up this paper about. Okay, here's another one. The pornographic violence in bloodbath slasher movies degrade both men and women. Okay, let's see. Let's read it again. The pornographic violence in bloodbath slasher movies degrade both men and women. So now this one is saying about, again, how horror movies can be upsetting, is it saying that it's very, very pornographic, okay? Like all this blood and gore coming out of a person's body and stuff like that is not good for men or women because maybe, let's say, it is making it look like it's romanticized or sexy to get killed, right? Here's another one. Today's slasher movies fail to deliver the emotional catharsis that 1930s horror films did. Okay, so just the word catharsis, so you know what it means. The emotional catharsis is kind of like an emotional release, like a breakthrough. Okay, that's what catharsis is. Okay, so let's read the statement again. Today's slasher movies fail to deliver the emotional catharsis that 1930s horror films did. So when I read this, if the student wrote this, I would go, okay, let's figure out what the student is trying to say. And what they're trying to say is movies today, when they kill, there's really no point. But back in the 1930s, when someone was killed in a horror movie, there was a lesson to be learned, right? So what they're saying here again is that today movies are just about killing. There's really no purpose or point in killing. Like you don't learn a lesson, you don't, anything. It's just killing for fun, right? Or killing for no real reason why. Okay, so when you read these three, I hope that you can sort of see how a teacher would read it and then try to understand what that student is saying. And if you looked at the previous slide, remember, all it said was horror movies are upsetting. But that's it, like we don't really know why. But here, each of these ones are a different point of view from a student, right? Let's say there are 3 students writing about the same topic, and we can suddenly go, oh, this is interesting because this person thinks about it this way, this person thinks about it this way, this person thinks about it this way. So when you write your paper, you need to show me what you're thinking. Okay, and sometimes you might not necessarily know what you're thinking yet, so that's why we ask you to do, 5 article research first before you start writing your thesis, so you can sort of see, what the research is saying so far. So, okay, I think this is where I'm coming from. Okay, is your thesis statement clear? Your thesis statement is no exception to your writing. It needs to be as clear as possible. By being as clear as possible in your thesis statement, you will make sure that your reader understands exactly what you mean. So again, this is just about clear writing, right? If you look at those previous revision statements in the previous slide, you can sort of see, it's only like 1 or 2 sentences long, but it really builds an impact and I can envision it as a reader, what you're trying to tell me. All right, let's talk about some tips. In order to be as clear as possible in your writing, unless you're writing a technical report, avoid technical language. Always avoid jargon unless you are confident your audience will be familiar with it. Okay, so there's a couple of words I think I want to define with you just to make sure you understand what it means. Technical language. So technical language is basically very specific to one field. Because you are writing about disability, and I'm your disability instructor here, and at-risk populations, you can actually use some technical language unless it's like really hard to know, unless you're really into it, right? So for me as a teacher about disability, if you talk in general technical terms, I totally get it, like ABA, right? Or let's say conditioning or punishment. Those things I will know, and those are considered technical words in our field, right? Or let's say when it comes to an at-risk population, let's talk about people in prison. If you use formerly incarcerated population as their phrase, I get that. I understand that, right? So it's okay to use some technical one if you're writing specifically for a technical field. And then jargon, which is the other word in that sentence, jargon just basically means slang in that field. It's kind of like, let's say, if a student wrote something like, her nails are on fleek, right? On fleek is a slang word that was very popular a couple years ago, but not everyone knows what that means. So you want to avoid that in your writing, right? So that no one will go, what does that mean? And then they have to look up words. So again, always avoid jargon unless you are confident your audience will be familiar with it, right? All right, next thing, avoid vague words such as interesting, negative, exciting, unusual, and difficult. So those are some words that people will use in their writing, but it really doesn't mean anything, okay? When you say, let's say someone asks you, hey, how did you feel about that movie? And you're like, well, it was interesting. Can you tell whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing? Anything? No, because that word is really vague. So when people choose to use those words purposefully, right, that means that they either don't know how they're feeling or they just don't care, right? And when we do writing in this class, we want you to care about the topics. So you want to explain it a little bit more than the word interesting, okay? Or exciting, because exciting could be bad or good exciting as well. Negative, depending on how bad it is, it could be very bad or not very bad at all. But those would be both negative words, right? So we want to be able to see the intensity of the word when you choose the word that you're using. Okay? Okay, the next one is avoid abstract words such as society, values, and culture. So there's a kind of a little thing about this one, which I want to point out, which is society, values, and culture actually are really popular words to use right now, but we want to hear more specific words that are associated with it. So you want to say culture, do you mean Latin culture? Do you mean African American or Black culture? Do you mean Asian culture? Do you mean indigenous culture? Do you mean white culture or Caucasian culture, right? So that makes it more specific and clear, right? But when you say culture, people are going to go, what does that mean? Does it mean gay culture? Does it mean veteran culture? Does it mean gamer culture? We don't know. You need to be more specific, right? Or values. Okay, as an Asian person, my values that I was brought up with are very, very different than someone who is, let's say, Black or Caucasian, right? Or Latin or indigenous. So we want you to start using specific words to add on if you're going to use one of these words. These words tell the reader next to nothing if you do not carefully explain what you mean by them. Never assume that the meaning of a sentence is obvious. Check to see if you need to define your terms like socialism, conventional, commercialism, society. And the reason why is because, again, depending on who you talk to, those words can actually have very different meanings, right? So we want to make sure that you add words to it or define it for us so that we understand what you mean. Okay, and then decide on the most appropriate place to do so. Do not assume, for example, that you have the same understanding of what society means as your reader. To avoid misunderstandings, be as specific as possible. And that's very true. Here's an example when it comes to disability. Let's say that there is a child who's throwing a tantrum. A tantrum could mean a lot of things for a lot of people, okay? One person might go, a tantrum is someone who like goes, I don't want to do this, right? And kind of like being a brat, right? Or it could be someone who's like throwing bottles and chairs at people. And they're like, that's a tantrum. So those two things are very different, right? One is like, let's say, very physically violent, and one is more like, I'm just not really interested in doing this, and I don't want to do it, right? You can't make me do it. So again, so when you use the word tantrum, then you need to define it in your paper. In this paper, tantrum is defined as blah, 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 blah. So that when we read the word tantrum in the rest of your paper, we know exactly what you're talking about. We're not wondering what that means. Or the worst thing is if someone reads it and then they have their own definition and it's not yours, and then they misinterpret what you're saying. All right, compare the original thesis, not specific and clear enough, with the revised version, much more specific and clear. So again, now we're going to start to see some more examples now that you understand a little bit more about thesis statements. Okay, here is the original thesis. Although the timber wolf is a timid and gentle animal, it is being systematically exterminated. So the concern here is that if it is so timid and gentle, timid means shy, and gentle, why is it being exterminated? Exterminated is just a fancy word for saying being killed, okay, or getting rid of. So let's read the statement again. Although the timber wolf is a timid and gentle animal, it is being systematically exterminated. Which basically is saying is, although this wolf is shy and nice, it's being killed all the time. So when you read that, you're like, why? I don't understand what this means. So now let's look at the revised thesis. Okay. Although the timber wolf is actually a timid and gentle animal, it is being systematically exterminated because people wrongfully believe it to be a fierce and cold-blooded killer. So now we're understanding, even though this animal is actually very nice, people think that it is a very vicious, crazy animal. So they're going to kill it, right? So that's like, okay, that makes sense because its appearance is not matching up with its behaviors, right? That's what this is saying. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Let's read more about this. Why are they so timid, and why are they, why are people always thinking that they're evil, right? So that paper will be a little bit more interesting because the previous one, it didn't really make sense at all. Okay, so let's continue this and we'll see some more examples as we go along with this lecture. Okay, does your thesis include a comment about your position on the issue at hand? So now, again, like I said before, when you write a paper, you should have a perspective. Where are you coming from? What is your point of view on this topic? The thesis statement should do more than merely announce the topic. It must reveal the position you will take in relation to that topic, how you plan to analyze, evaluate the subject or the issue. In short, instead of merely stating a general fact or resorting to a simplistic pro-con statement, you must decide what it is that you have to say. So let's say that you're reporting about gaming culture, right? Some people love gaming culture, some people hate gaming culture. Or let's talk about social media. Some people love it, some people hate it. I want to hear when you write your paper what your point of view is, right? So it should be somewhat unique, at least, one or the other, so that you can explain why though too, right? So remember how we said one or two statements? The first statement may be, social media is now considered one of the most popular pastimes for Americans, right? So that's interesting, but then now we need to talk a little bit more about why are they so popular, right? And then we can explain it in a couple of different points. Here are some tips pertaining to that. Avoid merely announcing the topic. Your original and specific angle should be clear. In this way, you will tell your reader why your take on the issue matters. Like I said before in a previous example, smoking is bad for you. Duh, right? But if you said something like, smoking in Asian culture connects the family much more. You're like, whoa, really? That's interesting because that's really bad, but it's supposed to be a good thing because it connects the family. Then that would be interesting. Obviously, this is just an example that I'm making up as we're talking, right? So let's talk about this original thesis. In this paper, I will discuss the relationship between fairy tales and early childhood. So if you read that, let me read it again. In this paper, I will discuss the relationship between fairy tales and early childhood. Well, if I am the teacher and I'm reading this, I'm like, duh, children always read fairy tales when they're growing up, right? Usually that's what, parents will read, like, watching Snow White or Cinderella or I don't know what kids are watching these days, but those are fairy tales, right? So they're like, okay, well, I know kids read fairy tales. Not a big deal. So now let's do a revised version of that. Not just empty stories for kids, fairy tales shed light on the psychology of young children. See, now that's a little bit more interesting. Let me reread it again. Not just empty stories for kids, fairy tales shed light on the psychology of young children. So what that is saying is, fairy tales are not meaningless. They're actually teaching people, kids, adults, how children think, right? And how they behave and how they learn a lesson. Now that's a little bit more interesting, right? Because you're like, okay, we're gonna really, make a point about how interesting this could actually be. Okay. Avoid making universal or pro-con judgments that oversimplify complex issues. Okay, so universal basically means everyone, right, or everything. So avoid making universal or pro-con judgments. Okay, so don't just say everyone believes this, because let's say if you took a poll, most likely not everyone is going to agree with you. So you can't say these broad general statements because it doesn't really mean anything. Okay, or pro judgments. Something is just bad and that's it. You don't explain why. So when I say smoking is bad for you, I wouldn't just say smoking is bad for you. You need to say something like, the reason why smoking is bad for you is because it ruins your lungs in these specific ways. Okay? You're like, oh, okay. Now I'm starting to understand why people are saying that smoking is bad for you. Okay? Or oversimplifying complex issues. So um, let's talk about abortion for a quick second, right? So, this is a very controversial area, and so you can't really oversimplify that complex issue because it's not just about, let's say, a fetus, right? It's also about the person who's going to have to take care of that fetus or that child when it is born, right? So there's a lot more implications. Can a 14-year-old girl, let's say, have a baby and be able to be successful in life? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So all of these conditions, or let's say, what if it is someone who, that young lady or that girl or that woman was raped by someone they know, or a family member, incest, right? Those are really complicated situations. So we don't want to oversimplify any of this type of stuff, right? Especially sensitive topics. So when you guys write about disability, it actually could be very sensitive. So you want to be thoughtful for how you're going to talk about this. You can't just say it sucks to have a disability, because if you talk to some people with disabilities, they're going to go, no, it's totally fine, right? This is how, let's say I was either born or this is the accident that I got into. So, it is what it is, right? But they're happy who they are, right? So again, you don't want to oversimplify. All right, here let's talk about an original thesis. We must save the whales. Okay. All right, we need to save animals, right? Or save whales. So what? I don't understand what the purpose of this paper is about. So now let's read a thesis statement that's been revised. Because our planet's health may depend upon biological diversity, we should save the whales. Okay, so now they're talking about, let's say, global warming or climate change, which is what it's called now. And we need all different types of animals. It's like, have you heard about why people always talk about bees or honeybees? And then you realize honeybees basically pollinate almost every food you eat. So if all the bees died, there would be no food for humans to eat, and we would die as well. So again, we need to hear about those little complex things. It cannot be just like, we need to save the bees. Well, why do we need to save the bees? So we need to see how your perspective is interesting. Okay, so when you write your papers, I want you guys to think about it from an interesting point of view. Try as hard as you can to make it as interesting as possible. Okay, when you make a subjective judgment call, specify and justify your reasoning. Okay, so let's just define some words. Subjective. Subjective basically means your opinion. Okay, so when it's your opinion, you need to tell us why your opinion matters, right? We can't just say one thing and then just go, that's it. People want to hear why you're saying this or how did you come up with this opinion. So, and when you know how like when you ask someone and they don't really have a real answer, they didn't really think about it, they might just say, just because. And just because in an academic or educational paper, just it's not going to work. Okay. So just, or when you make a subjective judgment call or when you talk about your opinions, specify and justify your reasoning. Just because is not a good reason for an argument. It's just not, right? It's like, when parents are and a child are fighting or arguing, and then the kid is like, well, why can't I smoke? And they're like, just because, right? Or whatever. The kid's not going to be very happy about that, right? Your teacher will not be happy to hear that either. Okay, let's talk about a original thesis statement that someone wrote. Socialism is the best form of government for Kenya. Okay, so someone believes that socialism, right, is the best form of government for this country called Kenya. Okay, well, that's your opinion that you think this is good. Someone might not think that socialism is so great, right? So let's revise it and see how it looks. If the government takes over industry in Kenya, the industry will become more efficient. Okay, so there we go. So now they're talking a little bit more about this specific type of politics and how it might be good because it involves or talks about employment in the work field, right? Then you're like, oh, okay, I'm starting to understand what you're saying. Let's, point out why, right? And they kind of said because it becomes more efficient. Efficient basically means it works better, right? All right. Avoid merely reporting a fact. Say more than what is already proven fact. Go further with your ideas. Otherwise, why should your point matter? Again, if everything has already been discussed before in the world, when you write your paper, it's not going to be really meaningful because we already know this, right? So again, you need to say more than that, right? You need to prove, you want to convince your reader to believe in it. So here is an example when it comes to just reporting facts, because you're like, okay, well, this book said this book said this book said that. That's it. So he's like, well, I could have just read those books then. Why do I need to read your paper, right? So here, original thesis. Hoover's administration was rocked by scandal. Okay, we all know. If you listen to history or read history or know history, you know that Hoover's administration was rocked by a lot of scandals, a lot of trouble, right? So let's look at a more revised version of that. The many scandals of Hoover's administration revealed basic problems with the Republican Party's nominating process. Wow, now that makes it a little bit more, right? Because before we were like scandal, trouble, what does that mean? It could be anything. But now they're talking the fact that because there were so many scandals, it proved that, let's say, the people who are working around that team were not really good because they were, let's say, maybe they're hired because they were the brother or the uncle or the cousin of the other person. So then it's, they're just bringing people in that are problematic, they're not qualified or whatever. And then that's the reason why there was so much trouble in that presidency. Okay, something that's a little bit more interesting, right? So before it was fine, but it doesn't really mean anything yet. You need to support with additional facts, additional ideas and stuff so that we can see that this is your perspective on what's going on. Is your thesis statement original? So avoid generic arguments and formula statements. Generic arguments basically means kind of like the most basic. We always hear people say, don't be basic, right? We're asking you, as a student, don't be basic as well. And formula statements, formula is basically something that's already been developed and you're just going to put it in and then take it out and then that's it. It's nothing really thoughtful or original. Okay? They work well to get a rough draft started, but will easily bore a reader. Keep revising until these theses reflects your real ideas. And that's true. When you start writing your paper, before you write, you're going to have to start thinking about your topic, right? So at that time period, you can be a little bit generic because you're still brainstorming. But as you write or as you begin to seriously write, you're going to need to really make it more interesting with proof, with evidence like we've been talking about throughout this lecture, until your thesis statement sounds good. Here are some tips. The point you make in the paper should matter. Be prepared to answer, so what, about your thesis statement. Again, if you said smoking is bad for you, I would say, so what? I already know that, right? But if you say something like, smoking is maybe bad for you, but it connects a family together, that sounds interesting, Now I want to read it because I'm like, how does that do that? Because I know that smoking is bad for you, it can kill you. So how does that connect people? And then you have to show your research, right? Be prepared to explain why the point you're making is worthy of a paper. Why should the reader read it, right? It's just like, you can't watch every movie that comes out, right? So you choose what makes that movie interesting, right? Might be the storyline, the plot, right? An alien is invading Earth, but it's blind, but it can hear really well, so you have to be really quiet, right? Whoa, that sounds interesting right there. That's unique. That's a movie I haven't seen before, so now I want to see it, right? Same thing with papers. When you write a paper, I want to read and go, what is this about? I need to read this so I can learn more. So that's what we're talking about. Okay, let's compare the following. The original thesis is there are advantages and disadvantages to using statistics. Statistics are basically evidence when you're doing research, right? So when you say that there are advantages and disadvantages of using statistics, I'm going to say, so what? That makes sense, right? Because people take the same statistics and then they can manipulate it, right? So what's your point? I don't get it. So here, this is what, let's review some of the different revisions. First one, careful manipulation of data allows a researcher to use statistics to support any claim she desires. And unfortunately, that is kind of true because of people's value systems, right? So let's give an example of COVID vaccinations, okay? Let's pretend that it's 50%, right? For some people, they might go, well, 57 is not enough to reach herd immunity because you need maybe about 80%, 75, 80% of people to be vaccinated to have herd immunity. And so that's bad because we really want to get herd immunity. But another person might say, well, actually 50% means only half of the country believes in it. Maybe that's a good thing because we really don't know what's going on, right? So again, people will manipulate the same numbers, the same statistics in this argument, and it'll be kind of interesting because you can see it either way, right? Another one is, in order to ensure accurate reporting, journalists must understand the real significance of the statistics they report. And here's a really great statement here that's really interesting, actually. So let's read it again. In order to ensure accurate reporting, journalists must understand the real significance of the statistics that they report. Here's the thing. When you do statistical analysis, for some people, 1% is a huge difference. And for some other things, people might go, that's not a huge difference at all. So then it becomes not a big deal, right? So again, the research has to be accurate. And the thing is, when you don't know a lot about research and you read research, it gets really confusing because you're like, oh, is 0.25 really that much? In research, some research, yes, a lot. It means a lot. It means it is a lot better or whatever it is, right? So when journalists read it, because journalists are not trained, they might misinterpret the data, and then suddenly the data gets misinterpreted by other people who get it, right? And it could also be people who just are everyday people. I have heard lately a lot of people, because of this pandemic, saying that they've done research. And I'm like, well, where are you getting your research from? And they're like, from this website or from Facebook. I'm like, that's not good because those are actually not trustworthy sites, unfortunately, right? We would love to, but that's not really what the data is. And then people can misunderstand and then suddenly affect a whole bunch of other people. Because advertisers consciously and unconsciously manipulate data, every consumer should learn how to evaluate statistical claims. So here it is again. Because advertisers consciously and unconsciously manipulate data, every consumer should learn how to evaluate statistical claims. Here's a perfect example, Yelp, okay? You go to Yelp to read reviews, right? Do you trust them all? I don't. And the reason why is because let's say that I opened up a restaurant. I'm going to make all of my friends write a positive review. So when you read it, it goes, oh my gosh, this place is glowing with reviews. Like, this is amazing. We need to go try it out, right? But that's not necessarily going to be accurate. That's false, right? Because all these people are their friends, so they want to support, or me or whatever, if this is my restaurant. So again, you need to be able to understand those statistics of that data, because I can say there are 10,000 people who love my restaurant, and maybe those 10,000 people are actually people that I pay to do nice reviews or whatever. Or I might say, if you give me a positive review, I'll give you free ice cream at my restaurant, right? So we need to learn and be considerate of all those things that may also happen when you are doing statistics. Avoid formulas and generic words. Search for concrete subjects and active verbs. Active verb are action verbs, things that show movement, okay? Revising as many to be verbs as possible. A few suggestions show how specific word choice sharpens and clarifies your meaning. So again, choosing the right words is really important. And all of your teachers who read will know when you're trying to kind of just fill up space, okay? So here's one, the original sample is society is. Well, as a teacher, when you say society is, we're going to go, who is a society? And what exactly is it doing? We don't know. So here in the revise, we would change the word society into men and women, or writers, or television addicts, or American educators, or taxpayers and legislators. So we want you to have a specific audience or group of people that you're focusing on. Is it people with disabilities? Or is it people who are deaf? Or is it a person with autism? We don't know. We want you to start to decide those words so that I don't have to go, well, what does society mean to you, right? Original is the media. We hear about the word the media all the time. What does that mean? So in the revised one, we might say the new breed of television reporters, or it might be the advertisers, those are media, or hard-hitting print journalists, or horror flicks is the media, TV movies of the week, sitcoms, National Public Radio, Top 40 Bop Till You Drop. We don't really know what you're talking about when you say the media. So again, we want you to choose much more clear, specific words, not general words like people, right? We don't know what people means. When you say people don't like ice cream, what does that even mean? But we might say something like nutritionists or healthy people don't like ice cream. Then that makes a little bit more sense, or at least interesting, right? And then I would want to then start to continue reading your paper to see where you're going. Original is, are, was, to be, or to do, or to make. We hear about that all the time in your papers, so we want to ask you to choose better action verbs, okay? So again, action verbs are basically words that talk about movement in one way or another. So instead you can say to generate, or to demolish. To demolish means to destroy. To batter is also to hit. To revolt is to protest. To discover, to flip, to signify, to endure. So those are much more action-oriented words that we want to hear in your paper. We don't just say, you know, running is good for you. No, instead we want to say running reduces the amount of fat in your body, which allows your endorphins to race or something like that. Then it sounds a little bit more interesting. You know, is always going to be very boring after a while. Use your own words in thesis statements and avoid quoting. Here's another thing that I want you guys to know. Quoting is something that you do when you're in high school, junior high school, or elementary school. And the reason why is because you haven't really developed all the processing skills in your head. And once you are in college, when you read, you should be able to summarize or get the big picture of what you're reading. And then that means that we want you to have your own words. Do not quote all the time. Quoting a lot means, hey, why didn't I just read the original quote that you read? Like, why don't I just read that book instead? Because all you do is you're just saying exactly what that book is saying. So you're just kind of copying, right? And that's not helpful. That's not interesting for a teacher to read because that's showing me that you know how to look at another book and copy it over, but do you know how to think about what you just read and then report it to us? Okay, so crafting an original, insightful, and memorable thesis makes a distinct impression on a reader because when you are able to summarize things that you read, I'm going to go, that's impressive that you can figure out and understand what the themes, the patterns, and stuff that are going on when you're reading through a bunch of stuff. You will lose credibility as a writer if you become only a mouthpiece or a copyist, right? So again, teachers will go, well, this person just, all they did was just copy quotes from another book or a journal article. They didn't do anything. They didn't even think about it, right? You will gain credibility by grabbing the reader with your own ideas and words. Credibility is kind of like your reputation, okay? A well-crafted thesis statement reflects well-crafted ideas. It signals a writer who has intelligence, commitment, and enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is like passion, right? You guys say that you're passionate about the field of disability or at-risk populations. Show it to me in your writing. And I'm looking really, really forward to reading your papers at the end of this semester, the end of this lecture. Bye.